Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to the first Sweet Spot podcast for 2024. This is number 22, and today's topic will be about transformation and transaction and anything on a sliding scale in between. So we welcome today Dr. Alis Anagnostakis. Hopefully I've got that correct. If I've not, I'm sure Alice will correct me, who's a researcher, she's a coach, and has a PhD as well. And she's going to tell us really quite a bit about the subject and some different perspectives on it, because she runs a thing called the Vertical Development Institute. We first met when Alice had done a coaching workshop for us on that very same topic. And I found it absolutely intriguing. So I reached out to Alice and see if she would do the podcast. And here she is today. So over to you, Alice. Please let us know a bit about yourself.
Yeah, hi, John, and hi, Ben. Thank you for having me. My last name is always a mouthful, so I don't even try. But it does have a funny story, because it means the one who reads in Greek. And I thought that's it's always a nice synchronicity when a nerd gets a nerd's name. I was intrigued by the polarity you put on the table for this episode, transaction and transformation, and I can't wait to unpack, because I come at it from the perspective of human growth, which is my field of study and of interest. So we don't really use the word transaction, or I don't really use it in my work, but then when you kind of framed what it means for you and how you thought of this polarity, I thought, oh, that's a really interesting new angle. I'd love to kind of think through it that way. Briefly about me, I've come into research from a background in practice, in facilitation and coaching for many years. And I was always intrigued by why transformation seems to be so elusive. And by transformation, I mean real growth, real change that translates into very different behaviors than people had when they entered a process of coaching, let's say, or of learning, long-form learning. So I was really intrigued, and in particular in coaching, it seems sometimes, and I think all of us who are in this space have had this experience, where you're the same coach, or supposedly you're the same coach, but then not all of your clients progress in the same way. Some have incredible breakthroughs, some seem stuck in their own patterns. So from that perspective, I was really intrigued to understand what transformation means. Plus, we use the word quite a bit, and I think at times it's just a bit devoid of meaning. It's become a bit of a meme. So I studied how adults grow and transform in fundamental ways through their lifetime. And all of my work now is trying to bridge those two spaces, try to the best of my abilities to translate the research into practices we can use in our coaching or in our facilitation work. So
Brilliant.
that's me in a nutshell.
That's wonderful. So I think it's going to be a really exciting discussion today. So leading off with just a very simple question, and I know we've had some sort of offline discussions briefly about this, is how would you see transaction and transformation? And by the way, I do agree with you, transformation has become into the lexicon a bit of a meme now, to the point it's almost become, I wouldn't say meaningless, but basically a bit nebulous, shall we say. So maybe give us your perspective on that, and how you think that sort of could or may integrate with the work you do in terms of vertical development.
Well, the first thing that comes to mind for me is the impact of learning. And I really like something that Bob Kegan was one of the big names in developmental research. He works at Harvard, and he coined the term immunity to change. But he makes this distinction between information and transformation. And he says information is what you put into the current form of your mind. So your worldview stays the same, but you're more informed, you know more stuff. It's something that we call in the field horizontal development as well. We could use it as a synonym in a sense. Mm-hmm. So we can learn more stuff. We can learn more technical skill that informs how we go about things, and that's very useful. But then there comes a moment when we need to look at things in a very different way. There are moments in life, like COVID-19 is a really interesting collective example, when life just simply baffles you to the point where none of your previous worldviews make any sense anymore. So those are the moments when whatever you know, the content of your thinking is no longer enough. You need a transformation which means the form of mind, as Keegan calls it, itself has to change. How you think has to change, not just what you know. So for me, if I assume that what you mean by transaction is sort of the same thing that I mean by information, horizontal development, and transformation, vertical development, we put on the other side of this polarity. It's what we know versus how we know, and both are important. So it's not an either or thing, but they are two very different dimensions of learning or of becoming of a human being, or of a collective for that matter, that I think we need to understand. And I also believe the first one is much better understood than the second one.
Yeah, and I would guess that's because that's historical to a certain extent, and to a certain extent, how we've been taught to learn as well, where traditionally we have been fed information, and that's grown and grown and grown. And, I know when I went onto your workshop, what I was really intrigued about was, one, the link to self-awareness, and two, which of course is prevalent in coaching, it's one of the fundamental principles of coaching, is non-judgement and self-awareness, but how people could grow in a different way, right? Because of the self-awareness. And again, as you put it just in the recent conversation, is that it's about how people develop as much to, what they develop with effectively. Sorry if I'm using the correct lexicon there. So maybe you can expand a bit more on that, and particularly on sort of the vertical side of that, and what that means, and what that relation is between transformation,
Maybe it might be useful if we use an example, because all three of us, and I imagine a lot of the people who are listening, are either steeped in organizations or working or leading people, or in some sort of environment, organizational environment, where it's ripe with examples of transaction, maybe more than transformation, or we wish we saw more transformation than transaction. But when I'm thinking of leaders and how they grow, I think one of the pivotal moments in any leader's career is when they first become a leader formally, when they're, promoted for the first time. And quite often, from an adult development perspective, from a vertical development perspective, you come into that moment from a mindset that we call in the research expert. There are different labels for the different stages that a human being can grow through. So I use this label, but essentially this label means you're in a moment of your maturity as a human being, where your mind is, how you think is more focused on what I know, what I can do, what I can achieve by myself, because that's what has been, I have been rewarded for. And all of a sudden your context changes, and you have to achieve through and with others. All of a sudden you're in charge of a team. All of a sudden it's not just you anymore doing the work. You've got to support other people to do the work. So a lot of experts, literal and developmental experts, they come into a crisis moment when they are promoted, because they don't know how to lead. And we see all of these patterns of, new leaders being sent to courses on delegation. And then they learn the steps of delegation, but they don't delegate. They're still hoarding information. They're still doing the work for their own team, because their mindset has not shifted yet. Although we're trying to pump skill into them, we also need to think about how does this person need to think, so they are able to let go of the need to do the task themselves and think beyond the task. What is the goal? Who are the humans involved? So a new mindset is required to be able to embed that learning that we're trying to, offer these people at this moment in their career.
So it's fascinating, because I'm going to bring Ben in a minute. I think what you just described there is almost a bit like a paradox, because they're learning to be leaders. They've become experts. So they go on a course, for example, like delegation. And I've been on those said courses 20, 30 years ago. And they were very horizontal, right? They weren't actually vertical, because they weren't expanding.
There's an assumption that if you know how to do it, you're going to be able to do it.
Well, yeah, exactly. It was show and tell rather than raising self-awareness and expanding the mind. So there we have it. So that's really fascinating. So Ben, any thoughts and reflections based on your experiences? Because you had a number of different roles and etc.
Yeah, well, just one thought initially on maybe the difference between authentic transformation or transformative development, and I don't know if you'd call it pseudo transformative development. So there's I think, just to pick up on, you know, the kind of paradox point which John just mentioned, that in some ways it's only by doing something that you actually know you're able to do it. But I'm just wondering whether the more we become aware of language and developmental stages and different theories, that we can give the impression that we're actually more developed perhaps than other people, and give off that impression. But in reality, we haven't really embodied that development. So, and then there's the kind of, you know, fake it till you make it type of kind of culture out there. So I'm just trying to think what comes first, because with some people it might be just actually the process of actually doing something actually kind of creates that development, and then for other people it might be actually just thinking about it and talking about it is the kind of leading driver. So I'm just interested by that dynamic, really.
Yeah. Oh, I love you bring that in, because that's such an important point, because you can talk as a mature human, but not necessarily behave as a mature human, especially when the pressure is on. So what I mean by that is, you might be a very inspirational speaker as a leader when everything goes well, but then when you're under stress, and I've seen that so many times, you revert to what we call in the research, Valerie Livesey was the researcher who studies this a lot. She writes so much about this phenomenon called fallback. So you fall back, you behave in a much less mature way than you're cognitively capable to behave. But I think your point is really interesting, because both can drive the other. When I introduce vertical development to groups, I often offer them an exercise that I believe, John, you did when we did our workshop together, where I just invite people to go back 10, 15 years and choose amongst a set of different mindsets mapped against the theory, some less mature than others. But essentially, it's, what kind of a person were you 10, 15 years ago? How do you look at the world now? What would a wiser version of you think? How would that person think? And people always choose along the continuum of development instinctively. And they will tell stories like, 10, 15 years ago, I tried to please everyone. And then I realized I'm important too. And I started to ask myself questions. Who am I? What matters for me? Which we know is a developmental movement in itself, from, the being defined through the collective that I belong to being able to coin my own identity, and later on letting that go in turn. So people will retrospectively realize how much they've grown, because they did grow by doing, by facing hard stuff and then figuring it out, and then not even realizing how their mind has transformed. Or leaders will say 10 years after their first leadership position, I've learned to be more tolerant. I've learned to be more curious. I've learned to inquire. I've learned to respect people's diversity of thought. I was very black and white when I started this, which, when we look at the theory, black and white does belong to a certain stage of development, which is earlier, less mature than the multifaceted, nuanced, curious, inquisitive thought. But that person never knew any developmental theory. They just developed. And the other way around, to your point, Ben, you can teach people developmental theory. And I see this push in organization at the moment, where there's this almost drive to push everyone to the later stages. And the later stages become this sort of goal that everyone needs to tick that box. And of course, that doesn't happen like that. So people can learn the theory and then they can speak the theory, but they don't necessarily embody the theory. In my view, the first is maybe healthier than the latter. But then I do believe that if we educate people about adult development, that can help them almost sense into what is next. So when it's held properly, knowing the theory can become a catalyst for growth, because you learn to recognize the early signs that you're on the cusp of another growth spurt, internally speaking.
And that links itself to self-awareness, and the growth around self-awareness. So there's a couple of things that really fascinated me there in your response, Alice. One was the fallback situation, which I'm going to come back onto a bit later on. But also this point about people being pushed to the latest thinking and skipping steps. Because one of the things that I was trained in as a coach was a thing called the Energy Leadership Index and energetic self-perception. And I know we've said we don't want to get overly hung up on models, but is that the whole principle of energetic leadership is about you have to go through the stages and embed each stage. You can't skip one step, right, because you don't embed it. And I know when back in my consulting days when I was working for DuPont, they had a thing called the Bradley curve model, which was all about moving in cultural transformation, effectively moving from a sort of very chaotic stage to a directive stage to an independent stage, and then what they call interdependence, which is sort of arguably the nirvana. But the principles were that in reality, and we spent a lot of time working with clients, is that everybody wanted to go to the end game straight away, and actually, no, you can't.
Without the pain of the transition.
Exactly. Without, and we used to have fun with them around which was the most difficult transition to make, and they always got it wrong for exactly that, because of course they didn't understand the pain point. So that in itself is quite interesting. So it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on that a bit deeper, and then I'd like to come back a bit later on the fallback side of things, which I also think is interesting too. So again, Alice.
Yeah, what that brings up for me is so when I did my PhD research, I did it as a case study on one of the largest cross-sector, cross-industry executive leadership programs in Australia and New Zealand. There's about 200 leaders from all over, very senior leaders, considered top talents in their organizations. And it was this gem of a program with lots of thinkers like Bob Keegan or Ron Heifetz. So all of these amazing people coming and sharing their wisdom. And what I did was study a subgroup of leaders going through that program, measuring their vertical development before and after, and also getting them to journal throughout. It was a 6-month-long program. So every week they would answer questions about stuff that happened when they showed up at their worst or their best. So they really revealed not only their shiny self to me through those journals, but also their very bad moments. And to top it all off, it happened in 2020 when half of them were in lockdown in Melbourne and Sydney, or more than half. And we all went through what we all went that year. So that was a very, very interesting context to study adult development. But what I found was that only a third of the leaders actually developed into a later stage, a third stagnated, and a third regressed. So, and adult development was never made explicit in that program. So they didn't know the theory. To come back to Ben's point before, if you know it, can you maybe fake it a little bit or kind of speak to it? So that was out of the equation. But then when I looked at all the data and interviewed all of them, there was just one thing that was different in the third who actually grew. And that was how they dealt with the pain that came their way. So everybody felt the pain, but people had very different ways of dealing with the pain. And this was sparked to me by what you said before, John, people just wanting to jump over the discomfort and get into that late stage, whatever it is, but get to the end goal. And it turns out that the only people who actually grew were the ones who didn't jump through the discomfort, who didn't try to numb it. And I actually discovered a very specific mechanism that these people intuitively tapped into, which was to feel what is called in the research edge emotions. There's a Finnish researcher called Kaisu Malki who came up with these two words. I think it's such a powerful description. They're the emotions at the edge of our growth. And they can be anxiety, fear, grief, worry, shame. So all of the really, really difficult to feel emotions, they show up in those moments. So people who felt ashamed that they are disappointing their teams, or who felt terribly afraid about what the future will bring, or who grieved the loss of loved ones. We've had participants who lost family during those 6 months. So it was really powerful. But they chose to lean into, to feel those feelings, to actually sit in them, and also to be curious about, is there some growth in this for me? So they poured curiosity on top of the negative feelings and created something that I ended up calling a contrasting emotion space, that then allowed them to do something I know you value a lot, both of them, which is critical thinking, challenging your assumptions, looking beyond black and white and into the sweet spot, the polarity, holding the paradox. So people were able to do all of that sophisticated cognitive gymnastics that opened up new perspectives only after they went through the pain tunnel. So there's no way to avoid the pain tunnel. And I have the very strong inkling that that is not only valid for individuals, but also for groups. So now in my corporate work, I'm kind of challenging my clients around this push for, you know, do we have 5 steps to shift everyone into a transforming stage? And I will confidently say, no way, there's no way you can do that. And I don't think there is any value in even trying to do that, because it beats the purpose. If you want genuine growth, it has to go through the discomfort, not around it.
Yeah,
I'm not sure if this is helpful in addressing a bit of what you...
extremely. I mean, there's a bit of the no pain, no gain analogy, and again, I'll bring Ben in a minute. But I'm going back to what I said about. I was intrigued about the fallback that you described earlier on, and particularly when you said with these research cohort, you had, you know, a third moved on, a third stayed static, and a third regressed. And I'm just wondering what the characteristics were with the regression, because when you said it was the emotional response, it reminded me of Daniel Kahneman's, of course, famous type 1 and type 2 brain, you know, where the type 1 brain, the emotions take over the cognitive side of the brain, you know, because it's the fight, flight, or fright syndrome. But what I found particularly intriguing, the way you just described it, was that then it itself could be a slight paradox, because you've got the fight, flight, or fright, but you've just said that people who addressed their emotions on the edge, right, the ones that went through the pain, right, were the ones that actually survived. So can you, you know, put a bit more context?
They developed, they grew. Thankfully, all of them survived. But only some of them actually measurably.
When I say survive, I mean in the, you know, obviously in the growth context.
In the metaphor.
Metaphor. But I'm really interested for you to explain some of the characteristics of the demographics, and also again, you know, Ben, if you could come in as well, please. You know.
So when you say characteristics of the demographics, are you asking me whether there was anything in particular?
Yeah, you know, was there anything there was anything that was obvious that came out of the research, you know, apart from the ones that they felt the pain, then there was the ones that were stagnated. Were anything, and again, under the, bearing in mind we're on a continuum, but under the auspices, so people can understand, you know, and think, well, hang on, you know, that was going on there, that was going on there, that was going on there, you know?
Yeah, just to clarify, I think the people who did develop, they didn't necessarily go about it in a cognitive way either. They just accepted that the feelings they had held some value. So they in a way chose to feel their feelings. So for many of them, it was a very, very heartfelt process. It wasn't a cognitive process at all. It was just, I feel all of this pain. I'm just going to allow myself to feel it. And that was the spark of some growth. So the people who fell back, they tended to not do that. So paradoxically, it was actually those people who tended to take a way more cognitive approach to the whole thing by rationalizing what was happening. So for example, I'm feeling uncomfortable because this speaker is actually saying something that is not in accordance with my values, and I'm going to just shut down here. I'm not going to, you know, engage with this content. Or I couldn't really, you know, get into flow because the program turned online, and then because it was all over Zoom, I was distracted. But the distraction itself was actually, for many people, a way to not feel the feelings, to not feel the discomfort.
Right. Yeah.
So, you know,
really
it's just now that you say it, it's really fascinating to think that the cognitive that we prize so much, and we almost have this idea that, oh, we need to master our feelings through our cognitive. Actually, maybe it's not like that. We need to feel our feelings, get curious about our feelings, which is actually an emotion in itself. It's called an epistemic emotion. Curiosity is somewhere in that sweet spot between cognitive and emotional, because there's something intellectually interesting that has to be present for curiosity to emerge. But then you feel it in your body. It's like you want to go towards what makes you curious. So it's all an emotional process that actually leads to the growth. And what tends to push people into fallback, well, there are several factors. Stress is one that pushes people into fallback. Trauma can be another. Val Livesay writes a lot about these factors, the gravitational pulls of the organization. So if you are rewarded for behaving a certain way, being very achiever oriented, being very results oriented, you're not gonna, you know, challenge the status quo and ask uncomfortable questions, even though from a developmental perspective, you're perfectly capable and actually ripe for that kind of challenging the status quo. But you're still going to be in that transactional linear kind of.
So it sounds to me you're saying that's really interesting as well, because there are environmental factors that come into play there, as you've described, which is quite interesting, because I know when we look at your personal energy and performance, we've talked about the influence of changing your environment or the environment on you and your self-awareness. So I'm conscious that I want to really bring Ben in here, because we've listened to a lot now, and I know you've got a huge interest, Ben, in neurodiversity. I'd be interested to get your perspectives on it from maybe a neurodiversity perspective, and what you've heard from what Alis has described, you know.
Yeah, would you mind if I come back to that? Because I've just got an interest in asking about what your thoughts are on the collective experience which went through with COVID. And whether you talked about this program having very much a third kind of scale, where some
subgroup that I've measured. So yeah. Mm-hmm.
And have you seen any research? Is it too early to see what the fallout from COVID has done to society? Because I'd imagine it'll be a similar thing, that actually exactly the same kind of dynamic will be playing out at a collective point of view. So yeah, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that before I then go back to John's bit on neurodiversity.
Yeah, that's a very intriguing question, and I think a lot of developmentalists are asking themselves that question. And I believe, I hope I'm not mistaken, that I did hear Bob Keegan kind of suggesting at some point that perhaps this is like a collective moment of pushing, humanity towards a shift. I'll need to find the source for that, because I'm hoping I'm not putting words in his mouth. But I did see data that I can point you towards, which I'm certain about, coming from the Global Leadership Associates, which is a company co-founded by William Bill Torbett, with another great developmentalist, together with Elaine Herman Barker. And they are one of the companies who administer one of the measurements for vertical development. And they've seen changes, and Bill has written an article about that, the numbers that how they've seen the numbers change. And in the last 3 or 4 years, they've seen way more people scoring at a stage called the redefining, which is the first post-conventional stage. So it's the first of the later stages. So I believe the difference in some organizations was huge, from maybe 15 to 20% before to up to 50% now, people scoring at that stage. Of course, that alone does not tell us whether, the pandemic and this massive disorienting dilemma that everybody has gone through has been the cause of that. So we can't infer causality from that. But the shift in numbers is absolutely fascinating. And that stage in particular is a very interesting stage, because it's a transitional stage towards the post-conventional thinking. It's a very difficult stage to traverse. It's like the thing you have to go through to get to a more stable post-conventional perspective. So it's a stage where people feel lost. They feel like they're deconstructing what they've constructed for many, many years. And I think it's consistent, empirically speaking, with a lot of the stories we've heard around us, and I'm hearing in my clients, and I've had all of those existential questions myself. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, Ben. I think I would love to see more research come out and kind of looking at, how has the pandemic impacted, collectively speaking, our adult development trajectory.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating, because it's obviously it's as the kind of analogy goes, it's one storm, but we were all in very different boats. So although it was a kind of collective experience, obviously some people thought it was great, being locked down and working from home, whereas perhaps if you've got a flat with no garden and a few kids, and you still had to go out to work and be on the front line, that's a very different experience. And so it would be interesting to, I think it's going to take years and years and years to understand actually the nuances within.
But maybe just another thought just to add on this, that regardless of whether we've liked or not liked it, I think it's fair to say that it's led to a questioning of something that was taken for granted before, which was that work happens in the office.
Yeah,
for
true.
most people. So all of a sudden, a whole generation of people are asking, do we actually have to go to the office? Which now translates into a lot of a tug of war dynamic we're seeing in a lot of organizations where management, pushes towards coming back and employees push towards, because everybody knows all of a sudden that we can do work from home. So I think, and if we think of transformation from that perspective where we started this conversation, is looking at something in a whole new way, looking at something that you were looking through before. So in a sense, we were looking through the idea that work happens in a certain way, and that's just the facts. And now, all of a sudden, the very question of how do we want to work, or what is possible in the way we work, has come to the forefront of our consciousness. So we're no longer taking that for granted. So that is the shift in mindset, collectively speaking, I would argue.
Yeah, no, it is. And so just on the mindset piece, then John mentioned about neurodiversity, and obviously there is a mental layer to a lot of this sort of development, or kind of understanding this development. And I sometimes struggle with the way that we talk about neurodiversity today, because we tend to talk about it from a very medicalized perspective. So we get all of these different conditions, but the problem is that everybody is unique within these conditions. So actually, I don't always find it necessarily that helpful. Who I do like is a UK psychiatrist called Ian McGilchrist, who's helped me kind of understand a lot about my own mind, but also just so many other intersections in what we're talking about today. And so our brain is naturally, has two hemispheres. And the idea that nature created these two separate hemispheres, why not one brain? And his hypothesis and his work, which is really fascinating, is that they evolved for competing purposes, and just at a very kind of like the top level, the way that we pay attention to the world. On the one hand, the right hemisphere allows us to pay attention to the big picture, how everything is connected. Our left hemisphere allows us to focus in on little details. And we'll notice if we look outside, we can't see details at the same time as seeing the big picture. So sometimes these hemispheres collaborate, sometimes they're in competition. And the left hemisphere, which allows us to focus on details, is very focused on, in the way I hear it, is transactional. This very kind of goal. It's very much an either or. It's this or that, and I need to get from here to there as efficiently as possible. Whereas the right hemisphere is a little bit more receptive, a little bit more flexible, a little bit more kind of open to different things. And I don't know if you've come across Ian McGilchrist's work, and the way that we pay attention to the world, the way we pay attention to our feelings, how does that intersect with development in your view?
Well, I think I'm literally in the middle of listening to a fascinating conversation he has with John Vervaeke and with Daniel Schmachtenberger, which you might or might not have come to.
Yeah,
but they actually, the 3-hour one, I'm maybe a bit more than halfway in. But I'm fascinated by it, because I think they're without necessarily speaking about adult development, they're kind of touching on the whole idea. I wouldn't want to speculate, because I feel like I would be getting into a space that is not my space, and I'm so conscious of I think the more I do research, the more conscious I am of what I don't know. So I'm way less likely to comment on stuff that I'm not certain about.
Sure.
But I'm just intrigued. I'm intrigued by this whole idea of, how does the holistic and more linear kind of aspect of our cognition intersect in this journey of development, and connected and tangent at the same time. I mean, no, not tangent. I think it's connected. I have a very good friend who did her PhD studying gifted adults, which giftedness is a form of, we could argue, of neurodivergence. although it's a bit different than maybe ADHD or autism, but it's still, it's just a different wiring. So she studied gifted adults, and she has ADHD, and she works with a lot of twice exceptional clients. So clients who have both giftedness and so it's almost like you've got a capacity and something that pushes you forward and something that pushes you back in twice exceptionality. So we were looking, her name is Tracy Winter, might want to look up her work or put it in the resources for the episode. But we were looking at adult development and neurodivergence, the intersection. And something we came to, which is a bit different than Jan McGilchrist's theory, is that there is this, in adult development, we speak about lines of development. So the cognitive line, for example, is one line. The emotional line is another line. The identity line is another line. Self-awareness can be considered a line in itself. So you can be way ahead along some lines and actually behind on others. So this, we could call this the asynchronicity of development. So not all of the lines develop at the same pace. And one of the things that came out of my conversation with Tracy, and we're still nerding out together about this because we're both coaches and both researchers, so it sparks a lot of curiosity for us, is how does the neurotypical client differ from a neurodivergent client in how those asynchronicities happen? And to give you a very concrete example, I had in my work, I was using a lot the line of self-awareness. And she said, you know what, maybe you should look at the line of self-regulation as a separate line, because, for example, in people with ADHD, I often find that self-awareness is very high, but self-regulation is lagging behind. And actually, we're working around that in coaching. And that was fascinating to me. It opened up a whole new perspective, which I hadn't been aware of, because I don't have ADHD. So for me, that kind of line those two lines had gone in parallel in a way that I didn't even notice they were two different lines. But then when she said it, I all of a sudden looked at my clients and realized, oh yeah, I can think of clients that that could use this insight. So I think it's really, I hold the uniqueness of human beings really as a sacred thing. And I think if you think of development as this really sophisticated interweaving of different aspects of us that grow, then maybe neurodivergence just invites you to look more closely at what those threads are and how you can support that person in a different way.
Just before you come in, John, I think that's fascinating, and what it has just reminded me of, and John recommended somebody who's an amazing expert in the UK again on neurodivergence, which is Amanda Kirby. And she's got a way of talking about neurodivergence and development. She calls the way that neurodivergent brains develop as having spiky profiles, or people with neurodivergence having spiky profiles. And I wonder, kind of spiky profiles for me is about development of like knowledge and skills. So for me, that might actually sound a little bit more kind of transactional, horizontal, where actually there's also maybe lopsided development to go along. 100%.
Tracy also speaks about the spiky profile, but from a developmental perspective.
Okay. So
No, I mean, I'm glad you came in first there, because that's absolutely fascinating. I've forgotten about Amanda as well. It was interesting. I want to go, if we go right back to the start of the conversation, Alice, and you remember you said that people are very good at looking backwards, right? And understanding what happened to them over a timeline in terms of their development, but not so good at looking forwards, right? Which is sort of understandable. But what I'm finding really fascinating is what you and Ben have just talked about now, is the different lines, like self-regulation, etc., and self-awareness, is that historically, people who we're now talking about neurodiversity. Historically, medics were talking about just speech and language delay, and a very, very simplistic view of development, because they hadn't gone granular enough in looking at these different development lines, which of course has caused huge problems. And that's why some people 30, 40 years ago were held back. And that actually happened to my son. And that's actually the story behind it, is we took my son to see Amanda Kirby actually down in Wales. And that's when on the basis of some research my wife and I did, and that's when opened our lives to what was going on, and particularly his, because it made a huge difference in terms of how he developed. But I love this also idea of this, as you say, spiky profiles. I remember back, and you think about psychometric tests, for instance, you know, and at the head of the conversation, I know before we came online today, Alice, we talked about how models can actually be a slight help, but also can actually hinder us as well. And that Ben and I have had loads of discussions on that, and I know that we use psychometrics very, very loosely and very carefully in our group. That they have some benefits sometimes, but we don't overly invest in them. And I remember going back to 1988, a year or so just after I graduated, and going on a management course with a recognized consultancy, and you get a psychometric profile, and you get all these spiky profiles, you know, and you get balanced profiles. But people were being judgmental about the people who got the spiky profiles. And in one case, one guy was asked to leave the company. Can you think about that? You know, that's wow, you know, and that, you know, was in the 80s. So to me, what's really powerful is how this, the learning, you know, and the research and the granularity now, when we start looking, you know, our open-mindedness to look at different development lines, to actually analyze them rather than just lump everything together in a sort of homogenous mass, is making a huge difference, and will be giving people opportunity and expanding capabilities, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And I use psychometrics too, and I always remind myself to hold everything lightly, because these are maps. The maps are not the territory. And I think especially when we speak about adult development, any psychometric is a mirror, is an invitation to reflect, but it's not a measuring stick. You can't measure a human being with a psychometric. And also, speaking of the psychometrics we've got in our field, they're all language-based. So if you think of lines, if you master language, then it's just easier to fill it in. It's easier to express yourself. It doesn't guarantee a later stage result, but it's just one aspect. And actually, interestingly, the very late stages of development, where they can't be assessed through psychometrics, because those are stages where people reach beyond the bounds of language. They start to become aware of the constructed nature of language. So it's a bit of a paradox that we can't assess the very late stage people anyhow, because we don't really have, you know, the language-based tool has a limitation, which is language itself. But that's getting into down another rabbit hole. But I completely agree with you. I think we should hold our tools lightly.
Correct. But it's also fascinating in the current world. I mean, it's very topical, because we're looking at ChatGPT and OpenAI, which are large language models, aren't they? And people are talking about the limitations of these and where it's going to go, and the inbuilt cognitive bias around the coding that's gone into these models and everything else. So it's probably a topic for another day, Alice, but it would be at some point interested to get your views on AI and OpenAI and the large language models. I guess I've got one other thought and reflection. You know, we were talking about, again, or you were specifically talking about the people who moved on developmentally, that third, you know, the ones that had dealt with their pain. They almost felt at one with their emotions. They didn't fight them. They didn't numb them. They brought them into themselves and used those. Are there any other attributes based on your research you see of the people who tend to move, again, without being linear, shall we say, up the vertical scale? You know, are there other attributes apart from just dealing with you know, the pain and embracing that pain and then the anguish and the shame and all those other emotions? Are there other factors that actually help leaders move in that development? Because we're in a very dynamic world now. You know, people are talking about dynamism, we're talking about agility, we're talking about capability and speed, you know. So leaders have got to go in even faster than they have before, because also the markets are moving with it as well. It's not just leaders are moving, everything's moving fast. So I've been intrigued to know if you've got any thoughts or reflections on that.
Yeah, I think it's super important you say that, John, because I think what these people discovered around dealing with their own emotions did not happen in a vacuum. So there's always context around that. And I'm sure the context is way more complex than I was able to measure in my study. But there's one particular thing that I found that I thought was really fascinating. So within the design of that program, people also worked in small groups, small learning pods, if you want to call them that. who met regularly throughout the program. These were designed to be very diverse. So you would have a leader from a large multinational with somebody from the government sector, with somebody from the NFP sector. So very different realities. They all had in common leadership with all these challenges. But the people who developed tended to be part of the same groups to a certain extent, which intrigued me, even in such a small sample, to find several people being part of the same group. I thought, oh, what's going on with these groups? And then the other thing that intrigued me was when I asked them in the interview, the first question that I asked was, what's the thing that stands out for you? So without any prompt, if you think of this program and what it has meant, what brought you most value? And I expected them to, point towards the amazing speakers they had, the concepts they were exposed to. And almost all of them pointed towards their group, the small group that they were part of. And then when I started to dig a bit deeper, I found what I call the 5 characteristics of transformative groups. Again, I don't think these 5 characteristics guarantee transformation, but I do believe they create the context for development to unfold. And they were diversity. So the fact that they were very different was stimulating for people. It challenged their thinking. It was, oh, Ben, you're so different from me. Your experience is so different. It just makes me want to learn from you. You know so much that I don't know. But then the context was created for them to really look for the similarity. So they were really encouraged to bond, to connect, to look for what connected them, not just what was different. So diversity and similarity going hand in hand with a pair of characteristics. But then they took that deeper. So the more successful groups, the groups that often went on way after the program ended, they did challenge and support, which was the other pair. So they tended to be very candid, very direct, very really calling out BS if BS arose in the conversation at any point. But they did that with a sense of genuine care and support for each other. So there was no judgment. There was no, harshness. There was candor with care. So challenge and support, when those things came together, you had the psychological safety, but within that psychological safety, you also had being taken out of your comfort zone by the others. So, for example, one of the participants in the program, he had a realization that he was actually holding back from his board. He was avoiding conflict with his board, and he realized how conflict avoidance was this big pattern that was holding him back in his career more broadly. So he designed this experiment, went to his board and actually initiated a very difficult conversation, which actually went really well. But what he did after that was he went back to his little group and he shared with those guys what had happened. And they asked him some challenging questions. And he related all of this to me in the interview. It's like, it was the experiment that I did that was amazing for my growth. But then there was this safe but challenging space these people provided for me where I could come back. No facilitator, completely self-led, which actually made him reflect on his experience. So that whole process of vertical development, of shift for him, translated in, I'm doing something different in the outer world, but then I'm brave enough to bring this back and actually really feel like it's becoming a new way of thinking for me, because these people help me reflect on it. It's not just one-off accident that I, spark this conversation and I'm never going to do it again. So the 5th principle was consistency, because these groups, they got so much reward out of that dynamic that they created for themselves that they kept on meeting. And the more they did, the more it was this virtuous cycle or circle that they created. So I've started to reflect a lot on how do we create the context for development. And I think these 5 principles can be a starting point of a map. How do you design a group that is developmental? How do you encourage those things? How do you create diversity and encourage people to look for the connection? How do you get into, again, it's a sweet spot, challenge and support. It's a very, very delicate sweet spot to land in, where you're able to have both in a relationship or in a group and do that consistently. So you can actually see the development over time.
It's really interesting you describe that, because that situation with the CEO and his board is that at a considerably lower level than quite a few years ago, I had a very similar experience, because I was lucky And it was even before people were really talking about psychological safety. You know, there's that famous paper by Laura Delazola in the Harvard Business Review, is that actually happened to me, where I had a difficult situation. I had to experiment. I dealt with it, and I came back to that group. And again, you know, unfacilitated. So actually that really resonates with me and makes perfect sense. And this is the power, isn't it? It's all about psychological safety, self-awareness, being on the learning edge, you know, and being able to push our boundaries without too much fear, of course. And so, yeah, that's absolutely wonderful.
And having
so,
a context, having a supportive context around you,
yeah,
where you can actually unpack what you're going through and be challenged, but also feel safe. And that's a really tricky thing to have.
Yeah,
really.
As you say, that supportive context is both really important, but not always easy, is it? Particularly with different agendas and stresses and everything else. So are there any, just sort of flipping the coin slightly, because I find this fascinating, are there any attributes as well for the people? We're not really talked about the stagnating group yet, have we? We've talked about the you know, accelerating group, the developmental group, and the people that arguably regressed. But was there anything specific? Because I think it just provides extra context for our listeners, you know, about the stagnating group.
I haven't actually been able to find. So I've ended up almost putting the regressing group and the stagnating group in one category, which I call the non-developers. So then we had the developers and the non-developers, just because there was no difference that I could see. And again, we're talking about a small sample. So when you work with small samples and you do qualitative research, it's hard to generalize. It's not the same as, you know, doing quantitative research with thousands of people and then throwing out a theory. It's you need to be more humble about your conclusions. But there was nothing that stood out for me in terms of, you know, was there something in particular that the people who regressed did that the people who stagnated didn't do that caused the regression. What I did notice, though, was that the people who regressed tended to be very late stage, interestingly. So it was the late stage, the more mature people who scored high on the assessment initially, who are more likely to regress. And I can only speculate about why that happens, but my let's say it's informed speculation, because I did go back and ask a few of them, and they were intrigued to see their results after we finished the whole research project. So I remember a conversation with one of them who said, I realized that I lost my sense of perspective. I was so stressed, so pressured. I just went heads down into just task orientation, just do whatever is in front of me so I can survive another day. So I just, in upon reflection, he realized that his default before that massive stress had been step back, take a witness perspective, all of which are post-conventional capacities, which he was. He tested as post-conventional initially, and he tested 2 stages back afterwards. So that in itself was developmental for him. It was a massive insight to become aware of this capacity that he has, that he had taken for granted, hadn't even realized he lost until he actually saw his results, and we started to explore together, you know, what happened there for you. And that realization is something that Valerie Livesey talks about in her fallback work, because she's actually found that when people catch themselves in fallback, that becomes developmental. So paradoxically, when you discover how you just stepped into your worst, less mature version, and why that happened, and what triggered it, and what pattern emerged, that becomes a really powerful self-awareness moment, which then can fuel your vertical growth. So I think we shouldn't think of, you know, stagnation or regression in this context as failure, because when it is held, when it is facilitated, it can actually become developmental. Unfortunately, in the research, I didn't have the chance to have that kind of conversation with everyone.
No, that's fascinating.
You know,
but the developmental piece comes afterwards as part of the self-reflection process on the results. And it was interesting. I was listening to you as you talked through this, and I was wondering, and again, maybe you didn't have the opportunity with your research, and as you said, there were small samples and cohorts, is whether the people that regressed almost like had a perception is, you know, intellectually I can do this, I'm aware with it at the start, you know, I can cope with this, and have that sort of I don't hate use a level of complacency, for want of a better word, at the start, and then actually as things grew and whatever, they realized that it wasn't, and then went, oh my, I can't cope with this, and then went backwards.
Possibly. Or
Yeah.
if I think of Ben's introduction of Ian McGilchrist's theory, maybe it's a bit of the left hemisphere kind of taking over, where, as an individual, you do use that broader, more holistic capacity
Right.
quite a bit, but then you lose it.
Yeah.
And again, that's pure speculation.
Well, no,
Complete
exactly.
speculation, but it's intriguing.
Sometimes,
It's intriguing to ask what happens
exactly. Sometimes speculation is good because it expands the mind, and the thinking I had was almost like people, and I suppose regression is a very harsh term, so we have to be careful, but moving back into their comfort zones, whereas they start off, looking at the learning zone, there's the fear zone, and the fear zone takes them back into a comfort zone, which is a bit like, as you say, the left hemisphere taking over from the more holistic right hemisphere. So any thoughts, Ben?
Yeah, well, loads, but in just with the time in mind, I'll keep it fairly short. But I really like those 5 attributes for context, which kind of facilitators of potential development, and it makes me think about online, the virtual world, and about how so many of our spaces which we spend time in don't really have those attributes which allow for development. So, a lot of social media context maybe basically points towards maybe healthier development of technologies and spaces. And I've certainly during COVID had a really good experience with a psychological development tool called 29K, which was this kind of great context where thinking back, actually those 5 attributes were there in abundance, and actually I had a really great experience with that during COVID, and so it's that just sets out some
I'll add one more data point there, Ben.
yeah which is great. And then I guess just I often think about a lot of what we do in the workplace, a lot of what we do in society and politics, and what's happening online is downstream from education, and downstream from childhood development. And obviously we're in different parts of the world, but there's lots of similarities in educational settings, and also cultural attitudes. So there's a lot less of kids going out to play. There's a lot more kind of safety culture, where actually kids would go out and learn and break bones and play and be upset, and actually that's part of normal development. So they get to become adults without really kind of breaking bones or having problems and sorting out issues amongst friends. At the same time, education feels very transactional in nature. It's a lot about kind of inputting data to transact in kind of exams, so you get grades and then you go on to the next transactional stage, where it's a big piece. But are we going wrong with, if we want transformative growth in adult life, are we doing things wrong at a kind of junior level at school?
Well, that's I think for all of us
finish off with.
It makes me sad a bit, this question, Ben, because I think as parents, I have an 8-year-old, and I know, John, your son is definitely in a different age bracket, and I'm not sure if you've got kids, Ben, but it kind of, this work has made me think very, very deeply, both about what kind of parent I am and want to be, and also about what kind of environment. So interestingly, my kid is in a play-based kind of Montessori environment. She's broken bones and kind of climbing trees and doing a lot of that stuff. And part of the conscious decision to embrace that is my awareness of what you just said, that I do believe that we need to discover things for ourselves, and we need to be exposed to developmental discomfort to be able to grow through it. But I do want to share with you both really quickly the one compelling example that just will stay with me for a very long time. So in my relationship to my daughter and how this research actually impacted us as a family. So I was writing the last chapter of my dissertation, and I was writing this theory around contrasting emotions and embracing pain with curiosity. And she was practicing the piano downstairs and getting very, very frustrated because she couldn't get it right. And she was so upset that she threw away the book. Now, as a kid, I was forced to play the piano, which I never did to her. I never forced her to play it. But I had this, like, almost, I felt that pattern come up in me, that fallback pattern. You know, you can't give up so easily. Like, you've got to push through it. But I thought, okay, I do believe there is value in pushing through discomfort, but I don't believe there's value in forcing a kid to push through discomfort. So what's the middle ground? What does that look like? So I thought, how can I impart to her? How do I explain to a 6-year-old that she was at the time, this whole idea of discomfort is good? And she had growth pains in her limbs at that age, and she still has it now. So it just occurred to me to say, look, I just want to share something with you because this is my research and I'm writing it up right now. And I thought it might interest you. You know how you have growth pains in your legs? She said, yeah. And do you like that? No, I don't. But do you think it's good for you? Yeah, because it helps me grow. Well, your frustration right now that you're getting it wrong and you get upset with yourself is growth pains in the heart and in the mind. So when you feel that, your brain is actually growing because you're learning something and you're failing at it, which is a normal part of learning, and there's no way around it. But the frustration is actually like the growth pain that shows you your brain is learning. So if you didn't feel frustrated, you actually wouldn't be learning. I swear to you, of course it didn't make the frustration go away. So that's not the point. But she did pick up the book and she kept on trying, and she didn't throw the book again. She still gets frustrated, but I'm noticing how her relationship to failure and that frustration has changed so much in these intervening couple of years, just because it's helped me have a different kind of conversation, and it's helped her frame those emotions in a completely different way. So I do believe that understanding these mechanisms can actually inform the way we raise our kids, and hopefully inform, what we emphasize in traditional, or what we call traditional schooling.
I think that's really powerful, Alice. And thank you for sharing that personal story, because that was early intervention at a relatively young age in the education system. That in itself, I think, is really powerful. And I think we can all learn from that, from the point of, experimentation. And as you described, that building the brain, connecting the neural pathways, etc., is really, really powerful. So I feel that's a really, powerful story to finish on and let people reflect on. In terms of sweet spots and where we are, I think we've explored all sorts of sweet spots today. I don't think there is any particular sweet spot. And what we've realized is that, to a certain extent, even though transformation has become a bit nebulous and as a mean, it's important that we do transform. Transaction is part of transformation, as you said at the start, and we've got to be careful that we don't get into too many overly prescriptive paradigms. And we keep looking at this continuous development. And I think personally, the whole discussion of vertical development and its relationships, to business, boards, individual growth, collective growth, and also neurodivergency has been extremely powerful. So I wish you really the best of success and results for your work, which is amazing. And we'll be following a lot more of that as we go on. And thank you very much for your time today, Alice, because it's been a really amazing and edifying talk with lots of insights. So thank you very much indeed. So
thank you so much for having me.
Pleasure.
It's been great.
Thanks. And guys, please take a listen to this. Please like and share, and look out for our next podcast, Sweet Spot Safari number 23. And we're just working on that at the moment. So thank you again, everybody.